Good afternoon, everyone. I am calling to order our regularly scheduled meeting of the Intergovernmental Relations Committee. My name is Elizabeth Glidden. I'm the chair of this committee, and I'm joined today by Councilmember Andrew Johnson, Councilmember Scano, and Councilmember Quincy, and together we are a quorum of the committee able to do business today. We have 3 items on our agenda today, and the first is a consent agenda item, which I'll get to in a moment. We have 2 discussion items, and I am actually going to switch the order of those items so that item number 2 will be addressing our city 2015 legislative agenda and policy positions, and that we can get that hopefully adopted before we turn to our presentation, which will be from guests outside the city, and we're interested in their presentation. So first item is an ethics officer report regarding lobbying services, and every time that we have a lobbying firm, we do a search for conflicts, and so this is just that regular report, and this would be receiving and filing the report of the ethics officer, Ms. Trammell, relating to lobbying issues with the firm of Frederickson and Byron for professional conflict of interest, and as I understand it, the report does show that there is no conflict of interest. And so with that, I will move to receive and file. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? And that item is approved, or excuse me, is received and filed. Item number 2 is our 2015 legislative agenda, and for that, is Mr. Ranieri going to give us the overview, or someone else from the team?
Madam Chair,
then we'll address the items we actually need to adopt.
Ms. Lesh will lead us off, but before we do that, we'd like to introduce our intern.
Fantastic.
Sophie Wallestad has joined us, and she'll be working with us at the Capitol this year. She's a recent graduate of the University of Minnesota.
All right, thank you for that, and welcome.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and Council members. Melissa Lesh with the IGR Department. If you recall from our last cycle, we had proposed to you for the 2015 session taking a new approach for how we communicate the city's legislative priorities during the legislative session. This year we have decided to split our legislative communication tools into 2 different documents. We have the legislative agenda, what we used to call the legislative agenda that you're used to seeing, kind of larger, more substantive document that we are now calling our policy positions. That will remain a library of the city's policy positions on a whole host of legislative and other policy items. We can refer to that when there are questions about the city's position on a particular item. If something does start to move at the Capitol, then we have that document to reference to refer to the city's position on that item. So that will remain. And then the second document that we're going to be walking through with you today is the 2015 legislative agenda. And what we would propose is to have one for this year, and then a new one for 2016, and a new one for 2017, and that those documents will be more narrowly focused and be tailored to that particular legislative session. The priorities that we're hearing from leadership, the electoral results, things of that nature. And so that's the document that we have before you today, the 2015 legislative agenda. So with that, Madam Chair, I would just kind of briefly walk through a few of these, and I would pause for questions if that works. Starting with our top item, local government aid funding. The City of Minneapolis supports the current local government aid program, including increased funding and other resources to local governments. Property tax relief. The City of Minneapolis supports sustained funding for homeowner and renter direct property tax relief programs. Public pensions. The City of Minneapolis supports long-term viability of all statewide public pension funds without overburdening local governments. Transportation. The City of Minneapolis supports new and sustainable funding for multimodal transit, roads, and bridges, and secure financial resources to meet both the capital and operational needs of the expanding regional transit and transportation systems. The city supports a comprehensive transportation bill that provides cities throughout Minnesota with the resources necessary to preserve investments and meet the transportation and transit needs of residents, visitors, and businesses. The city also supports the state resources to rehabilitate the 10th Avenue Bridge, which serves as a vital connection over the river between downtown Minneapolis and the University of Minnesota. And finally, in that section, additionally, the City of Minneapolis supports more direct accountability to voters and local government by enhancing the role for cities in the process of determining these key transportation and transit investments. Municipal governance. The City of Minneapolis supports special legislation to modify the certification procedure for filling vacant positions in the classified service in the city. Data practices. The City of Minneapolis supports legislation that balances the privacy rights of individuals with the use of technology to improve public safety in our communities. Fire safety. The City of Minneapolis supports the creation of a community emergency medical technician, EMT standard, to allow fire departments across the state to partner with healthcare systems to become incorporated in a patient's treatment plan. Redevelopment and economic development. The City of Minneapolis supports special tax increment legislation to assist with the redevelopment of the Upper Harbor Terminal. Jobs and workforce development. The City of Minneapolis supports increased funding for youth employment programs, including the Minnesota Youth Program and the Youth Workforce Development Grant Program, to ensure that youth, especially low-income youth and youth of color in Minneapolis and across the state, have access to vital employment opportunities that create pathways for successful careers. And eliminating racial disparities. The City of Minneapolis supports state-level policy and funding proposals that work to eliminate racial disparities in the areas of early childhood education, public health, housing, building wealth, workforce development, employment access, capital investments, and certification, procurement, and business development. And with that last item, Madam Chair, I would note that you see that those titles are capitalized. That's an attempt to reference the larger racial disparities section of our legislative agenda that exists in that larger document. So there's a lot more detail in that larger document, but we wanted to keep this one a little shorter for communication purposes.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Lesh. I have one just quick question, and then I think what I'm going to do is move this for the purpose of discussion. I know that Councilmember Andrew Johnson has a small, I think almost technical amendment that goes on our broader list of policy positions, and then we will see if there is any discussion on either the broad list of policy positions or the short list of the prioritized state legislative agenda. The just quick question I had is, I know I had asked if staff would double check our item around community emergency medical technician with what the league's language was adapted. Did we get a chance to do that, and how does our language align with theirs?
Yes, Madam Chair. We did take a look at the league's language, and I think the additional language that we were pretty much in line with them initially, and the change is the last part of the sentence referencing incorporating the community EMT into a patient's treatment plan with healthcare systems, that last sentence, piece of the sentence there.
Okay. All right. So I am then going to move for discussion. I will move approval of the 2015 policy positions, which is the full list of our city's policy positions, as well as the 2015 legislative agenda. And I'll see if there is discussion, and I know at least Councilmember Andrew Johnson had an amendment to the policy positions list. Councilmember Johnson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just had a pretty quick, hopefully viewed as technical amendment on this. It is in specific regard to medical marijuana. I believe, just so colleagues are able to follow along, that's on page 8. The language that is currently in there is legislation to legalize the medicinal use of marijuana for authorized individuals with a debilitating medical condition. I will move to amend that language to eliminate the word legalize and change it to insert instead expand access to, so that we would see the final language reading legislation to expand access to medicinal use of marijuana for authorized individuals with a debilitating medical condition. And that's specifically because we have pretty restrictive language in terms of the state law around both the methods, around the ability to get prescriptions filled in terms of really a small number of locations out there, and pretty restrictive in terms of what conditions, medical conditions, qualify an individual for access. So we're hoping to see greater access to medicine for many different conditions and a greater ability to get those prescriptions filled and be able to get helpful medication.
So I will say, I think that Councilmember Andrew Johnson's language aligns with what I think was actually the intent of the existing language, which was that we would have a placeholder should there be an effort. I have not heard that there is such an effort, I think, intended for this session, but there may be at some point in the future to further expand access issues around medical marijuana. And it looks like, I think we had some emails, but staff might not have seen them, about whether keeping that word legalize seems to be important or not. I think it is whether or not we do. I think Councilmember Johnson wanted to have a broader indication that the intent going forward is to expand access with that addition of those few words, and I think that's certainly appropriate and aligns with the existing intent.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Councilmember Johnson. We will incorporate that. We'll check on the word legalize, but the intent, we can certainly make that change in the final document. One technical piece I would also suggest, since we're on the topic, would be to also use the word cannabis. That should be changed probably also. It should be cannabis instead of marijuana. So that would be one technical change we would suggest, as that's a term that's used in the legislation.
Great.
Okay. Then what I might suggest is Councilmember Johnson, if you might want to just amend your, restate your amendment, that you would also ask that we substitute the word cannabis for marijuana in our state policy document. And if you think that that is fine, we'll just go ahead and include that with your motion.
Absolutely.
All right. And so then we have Councilmember Andrew Johnson's motion to amend our state policy positions to, as he indicated in his stated motion. And are there questions on that motion? See none, all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? And that item is approved. So then we have in front of us the two related documents, again, the full list of policy positions, and then our more prioritized short list of the state legislative agenda. And I just, I'm not seeing further questions or amendments from my colleagues, and so I want to say a big thank you to staff. This has been a multi-month process, maybe 6 months, perhaps, of working throughout the city enterprise. So a big thank you as well to departments throughout the city for thinking about items, helping flesh them out, working with our intergovernmental relations staff to go through the lens of what really seems viable, what has reached the appropriate level of research, what seems to be aligned with what is perhaps considered politically reasonable at the Capitol and other lenses. So thank you very much. I think that this has been a good process of leading us through, and that's why you're not seeing a large amount of conversation here, because we've had that at some of our other meetings. So thank you very, very much to everyone who helped develop this. And so with that, all in approval of our 2015 policy positions and legislative agenda, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, and those items are approved, and we're ready to March 4th, just in time. So, and so now we turn to presentation, and I wonder if Mr. Ranieri wants to help introduce this. This is a presentation that is really for informational purposes only. This is an idea that I think has been kind of floating around, has definitely had some research and support from academics in terms of prepping up some ideas that relate to our property tax system and best use of land. And as we thought this might be of interest to policymakers, we thought it would be helpful to have this presentation. Mr. Ranieri.
Madam Chair, you summed it up very well. This, Mr. Nyman and Mr. Farrell, both, Mr. Nyman is a resident of our city, and I think Mr. Farrell may be also. Okay. But they are doing an awful lot of work on alternatives to the property tax. As you're aware, we've struggled for years on how to reform and how to change property tax, not only in our state, but all over the country. There have been some attempts to really reform it, like go back to a different system. And most of the things we've seen in our state have been things like additional tax credits, changing around exemptions, things of that nature. But the core system, how we value property, how we tax property is probably the same as it was a couple of years ago. The proposal or the suggestion or the information we're going to hear today is about a system that goes back a lot to an economic history. It basically says you value the land, tax the land more than the improvements. And it has been approached in some states, particularly in Pennsylvania and more recently in the state of Michigan. And it has brought interest to folks around the country. There was a study done here by the University of Minnesota, by others, and the gentlemen here have been very advocates for this process. They've been working closely with the U, working closely with their colleagues around the country, and have a presentation that talks about what this is and how it could be applied here in Minnesota. Mr. Nyman?
Welcome.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and council members. My name is Rich Nymone, and I'm here with Tim Farrell, who will also be presenting today. And we're representing the Twin Cities chapter of Common Ground USA, which is a citizens group that advocates for land value tax shifts. We'll be explaining that in more detail in a little bit, but basically what that means is that instead of the conventional property tax approach of applying a low tax rate to the total value of property, the value of the land, and of any buildings on top of the land, a city can raise the same amount of revenue by applying a higher tax rate to just the land value portion of properties. And this has been shown to have a tremendous redevelopment and infill effect, as well as creating other community benefits that we'll explain in a bit. We're going to be moving fairly quickly through these slides because the main point of our presentation today is to request from you suggestions for corridors and neighborhoods in Minneapolis needing increased vitality, to have modeled by an intern that we've received funding for recently. So we'd ask that you be thinking about those corridors and neighborhoods as we're presenting today. So before we go into our explanation, we do want to provide some context about why our chapter formed and began this campaign to ask cities to put land value tax district legislation on their legislative agendas. Two recent happenings have led us to do this. First, beginning in 2008, the University of Minnesota began receiving, or has received state funding to research this reform, particularly in the context of financing transportation infrastructure. And one of the results of that research is this report that was published in 2012 that models this kind of shift for Minneapolis, Richfield, and Bloomington, and shows where density is most likely to increase under that shift. So we encourage you to check that report out at the link at the bottom of the slide. And the second thing that's happened is that in 2013, Connecticut enacted legislation allowing cities to try this approach on a pilot project basis. So it allowed cities to decide whether to apply it citywide or for just certain neighborhoods or certain corridors, whether to apply it to all property or just residential or just commercial industrial properties. Before that, as Ms. Ranieri mentioned, Pennsylvania is where this has been mainly used in the United States. There's 18 jurisdictions that use it there under enabling legislation. So with this recent expansion beyond Pennsylvania, we thought it would be a good time to see if Minnesota cities would be interested using the Connecticut law as a template to put similar legislation on their legislative agendas. So some examples will help us to explain this approach. And on this slide, the Minneapolis data that's in the table at the top of the slide is from 2014, and it allows us to calculate the two percentages on the slide that are at the bottom. So the land value tax rate shows that the $276 million city levy can be raised by applying a 3.12% rate to the $8.8 billion in land value of the city. I just want to point out that land value includes land under existing buildings, so it's not just vacant land. That can be sometimes confusing. And then the other percentage on this, the other percentage on this slide is what we call the break-even point. So any property that has 75% of its total value in building value would see no changes in taxes under a land value tax shift citywide. Those above 75% are making above average use of their site, so they have a tax reduction, making it easier to operate. Those below 75% would have a tax increase, putting development pressure on underused sites. So here's some examples. The first is a parking lot on 4th and Hennepin. It has 0% building value, obviously, so it's well below the 75% break-even point. The Phillips Echo Enterprise Center has 77% of its total value in building value, so it's above that 75% break-even point. So the parking lot would see a 219% increase, putting development pressure on it. The Echo Center would see a 27% reduction, making it easier to operate. So we've been able to get more detailed data from Ramsey County, which we haven't so far been able to get for Hennepin County, and that allows us to show what shifts could look like at the neighborhood level. We're hoping that our intern will be able to do this for Minneapolis on both the neighborhood and corridor level. But in this example, the $24 million of the city's levy that's collected from the Highland neighborhood could be collected with a 1.4% tax on the $1.6 billion of the neighborhood's land value. The break-even point for that neighborhood is 61%. So then with the Ford site, this is from 2012 data, so there was some building value still remaining on that site, 6%, well below that 61% break-even point. An office building a little way down, Ford Parkway, is above the break-even point at 72% building value. So again, the Ford site would see development pressure apply with a 146% increase. The office building would see a 32% reduction, making it easier to operate. For the Ford site, this helps counteract the incentive to hold out for as long and as much as possible because the location is likely to keep increasing in value over time. I'm just going to kind of skip through these North End slides because they're fairly self-explanatory. They show what happened for a vacant lot and a small business in that neighborhood if that was shifted. And then this example shows that the $13.7 million of the city's levy that's collected from the St. Paul's east side could be collected with a 2.4% tax on the $550 million of the neighborhood's land value. The break-even point is 78% from that neighborhood. And this is an interesting example because the Ham Stroh's Brewery, which has 3% in building value, I don't know if people are familiar with that site, but it was snatched up by a guy for cheap right after it shut down, and he's been pretty transparent that he's just speculating in the site because he knew that Phelan Corridor was being put in just next to the site, and so this massive community investment would jack up the value of the site without him having to make any improvements, deliver him this huge windfall profit. Meanwhile, this medical building, which is built elsewhere on the Phelan Corridor, is well above the 78% break-even point with 91% building value. But the medical building is in a TIF district, so the city and county property taxes that it's paying aren't going into the general fund. And this lets us point out the advantages of this approach over TIF, because unlike TIF districts, this shift never has to expire and give businesses a reason to pull up stakes for a better deal elsewhere. It can apply over a much wider area other than being site-specific, so have a much wider redevelopment effect. And meanwhile, the speculator would see a 276% increase, which reduces the incentive to speculate so the site can be put to more productive use. So here are some of the other community effects that the reform could have. It doesn't create this incentive to be building intensive. So for example, with parking to put that under buildings or build a ramp instead of out with vast parking lots. It reduces vacant sites by putting pressure on their holders to either use the site or sell it to someone who will. And it increases jobs because it's not penalizing construction or sales or productive activity. It's penalizing this counterproductive speculative activity. And I'll pass it over to Tim at this point.
Yes, Madam Chairman, council members. I have some examples of how this has been applied in Pennsylvania, which has had it available statutorily within the state for decades and decades. And I have been in Harrisburg, for example, which was a very, very wealthy state capital, and it had fallen on hard times. And this adoption of this sort of taxation has been a very salutary thing for the state capital. I would point out, for example, in Washington, and this is fairly old data,
it's only gotten better since this data has been collected. $22 million in building permits in a rather small town southwest of Pittsburgh. And then in Aliquippa, I would draw your attention to the fact that building permits had increased by 200%. So this is clearly drawing investment and accelerating the rate of investment in new construction. And then we have been advocating this idea, developing it for quite some time. As Mr. Ranieri pointed out, the economic theory behind this goes back very early in the 20th century. But we have collected quite a number of civic groups that think that this is an appropriate and, in fact, advantageous approach to taxation. And again, to just reinforce what the points that Mr. Naimon made, is with an intern that has been funded by this money that supports the idea of land value taxation, we can create more data like was represented for some of those other neighborhoods. And so that is the basis really of our request, is to identify areas that you as representatives of the city would consider potentially benefiting from this, or questioning whether it would benefit from a change like this. And so, I mean, we've listed some, but I'm sure I don't need to go into this. You know your city better than I do. But there are areas in the city that I think could clearly benefit from this. And you don't need to use this website, but obviously we're very interested in hearing your ideas as to where this kind of trial or data study could be of interest. So now I'd like to open it up for questions to both Mr. Naimon and myself.
Are there questions? Councilmember Andrew Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So in the cities that have implemented this, I assume it's citywide rollout, is that correct? Or is this used for specific neighborhoods and areas that they're targeting?
In Pennsylvania, it's been mainly citywide. Pittsburgh, as I understand, just has it in their central business district currently. For 100 years or so, they used it citywide, but there was a kind of a reassessment fiasco back in 2000 that resulted in them just kind of limited to the central business district. In Connecticut, my understanding is that they're looking at it doing that on less than a citywide basis, where at a neighborhood or at a corridor level.
Okay, and are there any cities in Minnesota currently using this?
No,
We don't have authority to do this. I think that's the.
All right, thank you.
I had a couple of questions. One is sort of from the, maybe I just kind of missed your explanation from the beginning of the presentation, so I apologize. I was trying to look back through. But you were kind of talking about some sort of sweet spot in terms of the land value versus the building value. Maybe you can just take us through the initial premise again, and where or how you define this sweet spot, and is this sort of a very discretionary piece, or would this be something that if the legislature did authorize this tool for parcel use or broader use, would the legislature decide what's that sweet spot? Or, I mean, I just am not sure I quite understand all the components of this.
We were running through, we didn't want to bore you with the math, but okay. if I'm back at this slide in the beginning, you get that, what we call the break-even point of 75% for Minneapolis citywide by taking the total building value in the city and dividing it by the total property value in the city. So the $26 billion in building value over $35 billion in total value gives that 75%.
And what does that mean, the break-even point?
It's just there's always some point where you know, a higher percentage on a part of something is going to equal a lower percentage on a whole of something.
Okay.
So if you take like a pizza, 50% of half a pizza is going to be equal to 25% of a whole pizza. So that's where that break-even point occurs, is when, you know, essentially 3% of the land value equals 1% of the total value. I know that's a little confusing, but if you actually started looking at some specific examples and looking at properties, you'd see that when you look at a property with 75% in its building value, they wouldn't pay any different under a conventional property tax as they would under a land value tax. But if it was above that point, they'd see a reduction. If they're below that point, they'd see an increase.
It's the dividing line between essentially winners and losers if the change were implemented. And that varies depending upon what I guess the mill rate of taxation is, and that would vary in different places.
Yeah, and then the other percentage on this slide, the land value tax rate, that's just determined by taking the levy amount, which is $276.1 million, and dividing that by the land value amount, which is $8.8 billion. That gets you the 3.12%. So that's what you apply to all properties if you're just going to tax on the basis of land value.
And then if you could just like take me through again, sort of what's the intention of this? Because as I've kind of understood the broader intention, it's to encourage the most productive use of a parcel of land, which I suppose kind of says there's a certain interpretation of what's the most productive use, but maybe there's a way you define that. And so kind of the big example is, you know, a surface parking lot may not be the most productive use of land in an expensive area of the city like downtown. So, and, you know, so tell me if that's right, or kind of how you're characterizing what may be the uses of something like this, because in essence, you'd be holding on to that undeveloped parcel, or, you know, however it's being used, more expensive and less attractive by utilizing this different valuation system.
Right. I mean, that's the effect of what the shift would have. I guess the overall purpose of it is kind of captured in the first slide that we had, which is that it's capturing community creative value. So the theory behind this is that the value of land is created by the surrounding population and wealth of the community, and the investments that the community makes in public services and investments in infrastructure and so on. So it makes sense to pay for those things from community creative value. So that's the purpose of it. But it does have those effects of making sure that land is, you know, put to its highest and best use, infilling where there is vacant land, and then, you know, making it easier for businesses who are contributing to the community to operate.
For example, we have a publication from the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce advocating value capture for investment in transportation infrastructure. And so here is the business community saying, you know, like when you run the Green Line down University Avenue, all of a sudden those properties along University Avenue, because of nothing that the property owners have done, has become a whole lot more valuable. And so this is a value capture of that. It's a public investment. We as taxpayers have paid for that, either as national taxpayers or state taxpayers or municipal taxpayers. But the adjacent properties, through no investment on their part, no additional investment on their part, have seen a substantial increase in the value of their property. And so this allows capture for the public of that value.
Yeah, so often when a level of government is using this approach in order to raise more money, either for a particular infrastructure project or just, you know, in general, it's usually called land value capture or value capture. If it's just being done in a revenue neutral way, it's usually called a land value tax shift. So that's just some nomenclature.
Yeah.
Okay, Council President Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So how would this benefit I mean, I can see it where you're talking about increasing values, but what about in a community that the values are stagnant or declining? How does that help that situation?
Well, it would depend on whether you're thinking of making a shift citywide, or whether you were just going to shift that particular neighborhood or corridor.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, we will do whatever the state lets us do.
Right, and our hope is that the state would allow cities to do it however they wanted to do it. But
So
if you're just going to just shift it for
good
I'm sorry.
thinking, but I can't see that ever happening in this state. They like control. They like
Yeah.
control. So anyway,
Right.
and maybe give me the two scenarios then. If you if you did the whole city, how does it benefit a community where land prices are stagnant or declining? And if you would just do that,
their taxes would go down.
Well, yeah, I mean, so if it was citywide shift, so, this slide represents if the shift was done for the city of Minneapolis as a whole. So in those cases, usually what happens is the overall tax levy would be shifted away from lower value neighborhoods towards higher value neighborhoods. So that's what would occur if you're doing it on a citywide basis. If you're just doing it for that neighborhood or just for a corridor, then it would be more along these lines. So you would have a similar effect. So this is just shifting that particular neighborhood of North End and St. Paul. It's still going to have the effect of putting development pressure on your vacant underutilized lots or sites in the neighborhood, and then making it easier for those who are using their sites in an above average way to operate.
You still have a puzzled look.
right now, neighborhoods or areas that have declining or stable values, their property tax levels are usually less than areas that are growing. So what's the benefit then if you don't change that scenario?
I don't know if I can explain it other than what we said with this slide, and that it's depending on what the average is for that neighborhood. You're going to see uses that are below average having development pressure put on them, and uses that are above average having a tax reduction. So it makes them easier. So it creates this incentive to kind of invest in the community and try and be in that above average point. And this, if you had a particular neighborhood,
how does this affect the private market then, and make someone come in as an investor and say, because of this particular tax tool, the way this property tax is determined, makes this a more attractive place for me to invest than if we had the traditional property tax.
Because the investment wouldn't be taxed. So I mean, if it was a straight land tax, any investment they made in buildings and the labor and materials that went into that building wouldn't be taxed. So it makes it easier for them to make that investment. So it's similar in that way to TIF.
I see.
Except that it's applying across the board instead of just one particular site.
I think another possibility is that particularly vacant land in any area, but including in an area that was decreasing in value, may be being held on to for speculation value. And the price is artificially high, it's above market. And if the tax were shifted to the land, so that as you have seen in these models, the vacant land is going to see a significant increase in tax. That's going to tend to drive the price down to much more of a market level. So I think in economic terms, the velocity of money, I think, would increase, and those properties that could be developed would be more reasonably priced to market rather than just being held on to for speculation, particularly in the case of the Stroh's brewery. They knew the Phelan corridor was coming through, okay? And so there was, with very low holding costs, there was very little reason to put a market price on that property. But by putting a tax, increasing the cost of holding it, speculating, you would move that.
I see. Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you.
And really what we're hoping is that since it's been proven to have these effects, in other places, that some city in Minnesota will try it in some way just to see, whether they like it or not. So that's what we're kind of pushing for. So if you have ideas for neighborhoods or corridors you'd like us to have numbers run for, and we can come back to you and kind of give you more detail on what it would look like, we'd love to have that. So you can tell us now, or you can email us at that email address at the end of the slides.
All right, thank you.
So I just had one follow-up question based on kind of your commentary about this Harrisburg example where you said that they did have a citywide application and then something happened. So is there,
Pittsburgh, yeah.
Oh, was it Pittsburgh? I'm sorry. Was there some sort of negative effect that was seemingly perceived from the citywide application that made them look for a more narrow application, or?
No, actually, it was. You want to take this? Or
Well, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, actually, it's the opposite. So they've had the longest history of it, so almost 100 years. And then, for most of that time, they were taxing land at twice the rate of buildings. And then in the 80s, when kind of the crash of the steel and mining industries occurred, they went to like a 5-to-1 ratio. And there's been a lot of studies done on what happened because Pittsburgh saw a lot more building permit activity than all the other Rust Belt cities, in that area during that time. So actually the results were opposite, but there was this big reassessment that was done kind of by this contractor who apparently it resulted in like identical properties side by side having different land valuations, and so taxpayers weren't understanding what was going on. So they thought, just for simplicity purposes, they would just go back to a conventional property tax and just leave it in the central business district.
Was not, though, also, I'm speculating on this, but 3 sports facilities were built in downtown Pittsburgh. 2 major stadiums and a hockey arena or something, which I think had a dislocating effect on property values downtown. And there was probably a lot of special considerations given. So, I mean, it complicated the situation substantially.
Okay. Councilmember Quincy does have a question, and then it looks like we may be wrapping up. So, Councilmember Quincy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I read the article that was attached to the presentation, and as you just identified, it looked like a lot of these kind of applications of this value tax district approach seem to be in Rust Belt kind of cities or developing, or somebody who had experienced a downturn. I was looking at Peoria, Illinois. Caterpillar had a big problem. Everything went down south along Peoria. Were all these applications of this use, were they in levy states, or are they in mill rates, or does that affect it?
I don't know the answer to that, but I don't think it should matter. I think it could go either way.
Right. And in the case of Minnesota, what would we do in terms of counties if the city of Minneapolis wanted to do it, but Hennepin County didn't? How would that work?
Yeah, well, in fact, in Pennsylvania, it is often just the city that does it, not the county. So, and that was one of the reasons why Pittsburgh decided to go to a 5-to-1 ratio after being at 2-to-1, because the school and county taxes were going up. So to offset that, they decided to increase to the 5-to-1 ratio. So if you can get more jurisdictions to do it, the better. But it still has an effect, even if just one jurisdiction makes the shift.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so very much for taking your time to be here. I think since this is an outside presentation, do we still do receive and file of this? Okay. All right. Then I'll just move to receive and file. All in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? And we have received and filed. And I believe with that, we have concluded with our business for today. And so we are adjourned. Thank you all very much.